We are here today. This is Jake Green. I'm going to let him introduce himself because he knows more about his job than I do. So we'll run the format the same way that we have traditionally, in which I will interrupt for questions. You can interrupt for questions. You can pop in on the text chat and ask questions and what not. So Jake's pretty informal and is comfortable with whatever. So, well, I'll let you say that because whatever is a really big amount of stuff. So, okay, anyway, without further ado, here is Jake.
Hello, my name is Jake. Jake Green, like Liz said. I work at the lab presently. I've worked there for about 10 years, I think, almost 11. I have a degree in 3D animation and game design, and I use that at the lab to make training modules with my team, basically, training video games, as well as videos and graphics and promotional posters and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, this isn't quite, what I'm presenting about today won't be quite what I do at the lab, but it's something I'm familiar with and interested in. So I'll go ahead and share my presentation, and we'll go through that. Oh, that's the wrong view. All right, can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So, 2D game art. This is going to be a very introductory kind of session about how 2D art is used in games and how to make assets for video games. Basically, all 2D assets are just pieces of artwork, so you'll see what I mean. So today we're going to go through a brief thing about 2D video games, kind of what they are, history and examples, how they work with design and gameplay, where the art is, and then some 2D art basics, character design basics, and we'll wrap it up with some tying together ideas and questions. So, 2D games, what are they? So, video games actually started in scientific laboratories in as early as 1948. They were using the same computers that they used to make ballistics calculations and that kind of thing. And somebody thought it had the possibility of being something that could entertain people also. So it's come a long way since then. But basically in 1972, the first home console was released. That's called the Odyssey. And there's a picture of that here with the green tennis sticker on the TV. That was a pretty interesting thing because it worked in the same way that the scientific machines did, in that it just shot a block of light. So the whole game on the TV was just a square on the right, a square on the left, and then a square that would fly between them, and you could hit it back and forth. And then they would put stickers over the TV, so like you could pretend you're playing tennis now, or you could play hockey or some other sports game. There was also like a haunted mansion and that kind of thing. But so that was technically the first home video game. And after that, a company called Atari, which you may have heard of, made a game called Pong, and that started originally in a cabinet-only format, like only to be seen in arcades. And then in 1974, they also made that available at home, and that's what this third image is here. So once that started happening, people started getting really interested in games, and seeing like, there's a lot of untapped potential here. So then a company called Midway licensed a game from Japan called Space Invaders, and they basically competed with Atari for the next 6 to 7 years, making new games and kind of pushing each other to make the next cool thing. So like Atari made Pong, and then Midway and Taito made Space Invaders, and then Atari came back with Asteroids, and then Namco licensed another company from Japan who made Pac-Man. And when that came out in 1980, that's when the screen technology started evolving, so they were able to have a lot of colors on screen, like a full range of colors, rather than the limited colors that they had before. So with Pac-Man, which originally was called Puck-Man, but they started the whole color 2D game thing. Then the next year, Nintendo joined the fight there, and they came out with Donkey Kong, which was, so Pac-Man would be the first game that has a main character, and then Donkey Kong would be the first game ever to have a basic storyline where you are Jumpman, who looks just like Mario, and you have to save the princess from Donkey Kong, right? From the gorilla that's throwing barrels down the whatever this is, rafters or whatever. So then, at that point, it kind of just kept progressing on its own. Not on its own, but more companies got involved, and they kept pushing the boundaries of the games. So in the early 80s, there were a lot of games using the same technology. Some 2D games that made use of new technologies, like this one in the middle. This is called Dragon's Lair. That one used Laserdisc technology, I think, and it was basically like, I don't know if you've ever used an interactive DVD, but where it plays a clip of an animation, basically, and then depending on where you click or what button you push, it plays a different animation next. So it's kind of a point-to-point experience, where in games today they're called QuickTime events, but it's basically a cutscene that you make the choices. So Dragon's Lair was the first time that that game mechanic was ever fleshed out into an experience. So then in 1985, Nintendo made Super Mario Brothers and released that in the US. They had Mario Brothers in 1983 in Japan, but in the US it came in 1985. And when the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, became available in homes in the US, that really is when everybody started getting into video games, and there was this huge, a huge growth in the market for games, like the viability as a industry. Like, this is something that people can make a lot of money doing. They can all be a part of it, in various aspects. So yeah, the NES became hugely popular, and then a lot of games that became classics were released right at the beginning there, including Zelda and Castlevania, Metroid, all in 1986. And then the next year, there were games like Mega Man and Metal Gear, Final Fantasy. Nintendo made another leap and made the Game Boy in 1989, and then the next year they made the Super Nintendo. And the Super Nintendo worked on a 16-bit processor system. So previously, all the games, well, not all the games, but basically, as soon as there was the Nintendo at home, all of those games were 8 bits. And what that means is that the processing power available on the console was only enough to show a very limited amount of information. So everything had to be very limited. Like you'll see at the top of the page here, the colors are very, very simple to begin with, and then as it progresses, they're able to get a little bit more out of the functionality. But then once the processors got better, the 16-bit processors was like the Super Nintendo and the Sega. Then you were able to see things like Sonic here, and I think this is Monkey Island. I'm not sure, but basically, every couple of years, every like 4 years, they made a new leap in the technology, and that allowed them to make more complicated and more expansive graphics. So they could take advantage of a lot more of the power of the system, as that power increased. So yeah, this third row that starts with Sonic is where the 16-bit starts, and then the 32-bit consoles. I guess the PlayStation was the first 32-bit console, but basically at that point, it became the limitations of the technology wasn't what was guiding the creators anymore. That takes a little bit of explanation. So basically, to make a game before, thank you, before the PlayStation or the Nintendo 64, you really had to work around the limitations instead of like just making whatever you want.
Forced creativity?
Yeah, that's right. So that's something that a lot of game designers go back to today still, because having those limitations makes it to where they have to solve a problem, and they have to think more creatively to make something happen. So yeah, after the Nintendo 64, there were basically no limits on what you could make. I mean, there were still limits. There were lots of limits, but it wasn't about like the number of colors you could use. You could use all the colors you wanted to use. The limits shifted from displaying images, which was the limitation before. It shifted to how much information can you run through this machine at one time, with polygons or other stuff. So this is just a really short progress from 2000 to today, basically. The PlayStation 2, again, they stopped using that 64-bit, 128-bit processing thing, because that wasn't how it was measured anymore. Basically, it became about a lot more than processing power. So yeah, here's just the basic timeline there. This is called the 6th generation of consoles. I didn't count through all of these, so I couldn't tell you like what was considered the first generation or whatever. But the 6th generation, and then every couple of years again they would try to make new ones. So then PlayStation 2 becomes PlayStation 3, and then they want bigger, better games. So they, increase the graphics processing and all kinds of stuff there. So yeah, this is then to today. And today, 2D games are basically, the sky's the limit. Whatever you can think of creating is something that's possible. But again, the people who make the games, they like to work within a certain set of boundaries, similar to the original game makers. They want to work within. Can you turn that down, Emily? Sorry. Can you push the button on that thing, please? So yeah, by imposing limitations on themselves, they're able to think creatively and make something that's an idea that maybe you've seen before, but there's like a new twist on it. So these are just some games up here in the corner. I think this is I'm blanking on its name right now. Maybe somebody in the chat knows.
I too am blanking on its name, and I totally.
There
we go.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's Stardew Valley.
Yes. So that's Stardew Valley. That's still a really popular game, even though it came out a number of years ago. I think they've been updating it. And then next is Fez, which is a really interesting game, in my opinion. It technically isn't 2D because it was created on a voxel system, so basically every pixel was a 3D pixel, so they were able to rotate, create. If you think of it kind of like Minecraft, except on a much smaller scale, so every little pixel would be a Minecraft block. The guy who made this game made everything in 3D so that you could rotate around, but as you're playing, everything is it plays like a 2D platformer game. So then there's Castle Crashers. This one is called Naruto Boy. That one just came out recently. That was an indie game that was kickstarted. In the middle here is Cuphead. I don't know if you guys have played Cuphead. That's one of my favorite games, and we're going to talk more about the specifics of the art creation. Cool.
It's really difficult.
Yeah, it is. And they talk in a documentary I watched about the designers. They talked about the difficulty there, and they were like, we didn't want to make it, extra difficult or anything. It was more about the idea that, the original games that they were inspired by, those were all pretty difficult. Not necessarily because they wanted to be, just because, that's just how the game worked. I don't know. So in order to make it feel like those older games that they were used to, they tried to emulate those same kind of difficulty barriers. So then this on the right here is Ori and the Blind Forest, or is it Ori and the Will of the Wisps, or something?
The first one is the Blind Forest. The second one is
so this is the Blind Forest. And then on the left bottom is Hollow Knight, which is another cool
Which is the best game of all time.
Yes. And this, I forgot the name of this one. It's actually not out yet, but it was teased a few years ago. And it was a really interesting looking game to me because it took 2D pixel art, and it seems to be putting it in a multi-layered kind of 3D world, and it has screen effects and all kinds of things that make it look pretty interesting. I just realized I cannot see the chat, so if there's any questions in the chat, if somebody could read them for me.
Yeah, I'll pop in if there's questions in the chat.
Okay, cool. So now we'll get into a little bit of how they work. So there's a lot of papers on this screen. So nowadays, when people go to make they want to start planning to make a game, right? They don't want to just well, sometimes they do just want to experiment, but when somebody has the goal of, I really want to make this specific game, they make what's called a game design document. This is an example that I got from a guy named Jesse Freeman. And what a game design document does is it lays out the basic idea of the game, like in one sentence. It's called the high concept. Basically, if you could summarize this game to someone that you want to play the game, but you had one sentence to say it in, like, that's the high concept of the game. So, game design documents can be very complicated. This was actually a pretty simple one, believe it or not, but they can be much simpler. You can make one-page design documents that just go over basically the concept of the game, how you're planning on developing it. You can do kind of the flow and process of things. So, like, you start on the menu screen and you click start and it goes to World 1-1 or something. So you can map out that kind of interaction there. A lot of times the game design document will also feature a lot of the art in it. It doesn't have to have the art, but it's basically a place where if someone couldn't play the game but wanted to know everything about it, you can look at the game design document and see, like, this is the concept of the game, this is how it's structured, these are the art assets it uses, these are the additional, functionality things that happen. So yeah, this document here goes through that whole process. It shows the sprites, the 8-bit graphics that it uses for each button, for each asset, and the map, and all kinds of stuff. And you can also leave, and don't think when you're making a game design document, you don't have to have all this stuff already. You can leave all this stuff blank. And then as you make a game, you can, fill it in as you want. It's really just something for a game designer to, if they're going to work with a team, they want everyone to know, this is the game we're making, this is how everything's going to happen in it. So it's a really great way for teams to work on the same goal without having to have, the lead designer or whatever coming behind everybody and saying, actually, I want it to be like this, because it's all lined out in the game design document, so they don't have to micromanage, basically. And then I got these other slides from another presentation about kind of some good things about game design documents. So their main benefits is that they keep your ideas structured. So, like, anything, and that's another thing that that's a good practice to get into, is if you have an idea for something, write it down. Like, make sure you keep track of something, because I've had a lot of ideas in my life where, like, I think they're really cool, but then I don't write them down and I don't do anything about them, so then I end up, forgetting that really cool idea. So this is one way that you can keep your ideas documented and, have these projects ready to go, basically. They also, game design documents will guide you through the whole game design. So it's a good way to keep your original plan with what you're doing. So, like, one thing that'll happen a lot in game design companies is that if there isn't some kind of document or something that ties it all to one specific game or one specific deliverable, they will sometimes be it's called scope creep, basically. So a lot of times when you're making something, you'll think of something halfway through, which would be really cool, but maybe not in this specific game. But if you have that idea and there's not a document saying, well, we're actually going to, keep this idea going and make this one thing as cool as we can, if without that document to tell everyone that, this is how the game is going to go, then, when good ideas come up, people get distracted. They just be like, they might want to stop working on the game or work on something else. It also is a good way to bring in newcomers to the game. So, like, if you are working on a long-term game, and you have maybe a new team member or people that you want to help pay for the money, pay for the game, pay for the development of the game, this is a great way to pitch that to people, to say, this is my game idea, this is what it's going to be, this is how cool I think it could be, and it's a really clear tool for that. It also acts as proof for all the project's participants, and what that means is that, like all those pages lined out, it's a place where you can, if you make an asset, you can put it in the game design document and say, like, put it in, its category. This is a menu button. This is a character animation or something. You can contribute content to the game design document throughout the whole process of the game development. And yeah, so that it's also a great way, once the project is done, to go back and, show everything you went through. Kind of talked about this a little bit, but the structure of the document is basically the main character in the stories, how the game is going to work, or the gameplay. What's the main character's objectives? What does the player have to do? What systems do they have to work with? Like, does the character have skills, or are there certain ways to progress that change the way the characters function in the game? So that's all covered in the gameplay. It also outlines the game art style. The style is something that I should have put more of in this presentation, but the style of the game can be something that evolves over time, and it can be, like, there are some games that I like to play just because of the style. Like, some people like to play games because of just the gameplay. Some people like games just because of the art style. Ideally, you'd have something that has good gameplay and a good art style, or something that people enjoy, on both of those fronts. It also outlines the sound effects and the technical design document. The technical design document is basically like the game design document, but it's more about the specific functionality of things. I've never actually used a technical design document, but I think it's helpful in the same ways as a game design document, just for more of the, like, programmers or people wanting to talk about how this certain game works. Yeah, and the game design document will also go through, or it can go through, the end goals for the game, like what platforms you want to publish on, who your audience is, how you're planning on advertising it, how you're planning on, getting money to advertise it. There's lots of different ways that can happen. So the game design document just functions as the repository of all this information. And so in a game design document, a good thing to do is make gameplay diagrams. So you'll see this one here. Basically, you're in a room, right? There's a door in the room. You can try the door, and if it's locked, you can't go in the door, right? So then you have to go back. You have to go do something else. You have to look for the staff ID card in the room. And then you try the door again, open the door. Then you're able to enter the corridor, and then you can see a zombie, and then you can fight the zombie, and then you can try the next door to the next level, and then it's the kind of the same gameplay loop. So you can. This is one way of like following the flow of gameplay that is pretty easy for most people to follow.
Do you want to explain real quick what the different shapes and colors mean on that flowchart?
Sure. I actually don't know, but if I had to guess, I'd say that the purple shapes are the levels, basically. Or this is the location, and it looks like there's a rhombus and a rectangle. So the rhombuses look like they're going to be the actions that you're able to take in that room. And then the diamonds are going to be the results of those actions.
Diamonds look like they're like actions, like things that interact with the gameplay. So it's door levels and they have like they look like questions.
Yeah, they're the yes or no options.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's I think you're right. I think that's where when you do a thing, it either has one or two results, right?
So I totally put Jake on the spot here, but what my real point is that the shapes in this flow chart are meaningful and visual and useful in that sort of a way.
Right. So that is definitely a good point. The shapes you use in the gameplay diagrams can be, ideally you would have a legend or a key. So like, if somebody was just looking at this, they would know what all those shapes mean. Because it does seem like these are very specifically shaped to be, this is one thing and this is a different kind of thing. But yeah, that's another way to communicate your idea. Like, every action you take has a reaction from the game. Yeah. So I had never thought of using the shapes in my own diagrams. Maybe that's why they're lacking. but yeah, the shapes can definitely add to the understanding of the people looking at these diagrams. And so there's also, you don't have to do this in the game design document, but this is a different way of looking at the game design document, just to kind of understand what it is made up of. So generally, a game design document will contain all the assets in the game, the gameplay, the level design, the story, timeline, and an overview of all of that stuff. And all of these can be broken down into their own sections. And that's why game design documents can be so big, is because like if there's a game that has thousands of 3D assets, then this assets part of the game design document is going to be enormous. If it's something that you document. But yeah, that's a bit about the game design document, which I think is one of the important steps for designing games. Now we'll talk a little bit about game mechanics. Actually, we're going to watch a video real quick. Let's see. Yes. Hopefully this works. I don't know if I have to do something to share sound. Let me know if you don't hear sound.
We do not. I think you just have to unplug your headphones. Is how Aaron worked it out.
Okay. she was just playing it through the speakers then.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Sounds good.
We do not. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Hey there, welcome to Design Club. So let's get down to business. Today we have decided to start at the beginning. And when it comes to modern gaming, things really don't get much more beginning than Super Mario Brothers Level 1-1. Level 1-1 is a masterclass in level design, an incredible amount of thought and care went into modulating players' experience and crafting the learning curve, even in the first 2 screens. Given the tight limits on resources for an 8-bit game, a lot of clever decisions had to be made to make this game appeal to a generation completely unfamiliar with games. Of all the 8-bit greats, Super Mario Brothers has some of the best examples of well-used affordances and it does it all without.
I can't hear the video anymore.
Can you hear me still?
There we go. Now we can.
Okay. Weird. I've probably messed things up. Okay, I'm gonna go back a little bit, and then hopefully this continues to work.
Unfamiliar with games. Of all the 8-bit greats, Super Mario Brothers has some of the best examples of well-used affordances and well-designed learning curves, and it does it all without blocks of text or requiring people to actually read the menu. So let's take a look at the opening screen. Mario starts facing right with a ton of negative space in front of him. Nothing's moving, nothing's apparently threatening. This static screen gives the player some time to mess around with the controls and get used to them. The way Mario starts also informs the player where they'll be going for the entirety of the game, going right. Just looking at the screen shows you the wide open path. Despite the fact that Mario spends most of his time in the center of the screen, the designers made a deliberate choice to start Mario elsewhere. This affordance through the use of space doesn't count enough work, but games today tend to leave the cutscenes on. The player never feels lost in purpose, and they know how to begin without even needing to be told what the goal is. Just move right. So, along Mario's wayward journey to the right, the first thing we see is a question mark, bright and flashing so we can't miss it. It invites exploration without being threatening. You can approach it at your own pace. So you do, but just as you get close, something else appears. Our first enemy slides on screen. How does the player know it's an enemy? Well, 2 reasons. 1, the sprite itself has some distinctly angry eyebrows. 2, the Goomba, unlike the object we've already
I am muted.
Right.
Yeah, to the freezer outside, yes. There's already a bag out there that has burritos in them if you want to load these up. I was freezing a few at a time.
That's when you were here last time.
Yeah.
It is totally reasonable to expect the players to experiment with them without the need for explicit instruction. And if the player dies, then it gets lost. The players just sit back a very short distance and ask them to try again. Short iterations like this are your friend. Immediately after the first enemy comes the first encounter with the power-up system. The player, being intrigued by the question mark and all the flashing, usually hits this question button, releasing the mushroom. The mushroom does a few interesting things. First, it moves right, usually following the player. This gives the player plenty of time to watch this USP and learn how it moves. Second, it moves above the player and then drops down. This teaches the player about how other objects are affected by gravity, unlike the block it originally came from. As an extension, it bounces off the green pipe, showing how mushrooms interact with other solid objects while virtually ensuring that the player will get it. Even if the player decides that, based on what they've experienced so far, that mushroom-shaped objects are generally bad and tries to jump over it, the natural path to try and jump over the mushroom puts the player on a direct collision course with the blocks above Mario. The angle in which the player would use to jump over it causes them to be knocked right down into the mushroom, while still allowing the player complete
know if I heard you say the outside freezer, and that there was already a bag.
Yeah, there's 2 bags in the outside freezer that have burritos in them. They're white. I did dig around in it afterwards, so they might have fallen down a little lower.
Oh, the outside freezer, not the garage freezer.
Yes.
Once the player fails to clear the jump, they're in the pit of the 2 Goombas, where it's possible they'll learn that you receive bonus points for stomping multiple enemies. More importantly, these pipes give you a safe space to practice the pit jump the player will do later. They mirror challenges that Miyamoto plans to present the player with down the line, but here he makes sure to have basic facility with the skill before really presenting it in a threatening way. Lastly, we have the final pipe and the first pit, where the designers put the game's first 2 secrets. The last pipe in the row allows the player to enter a secret room full of coins, and really this is for old fans of the game. It's for veteran players to be able to get through the level more quickly, back to a place that challenges them, so it doesn't have much impact on the new player experience. The invisible block before the first pit is another story though. While 95% of new players will never see it, it's placed in such a way that if you're really going to miss your jump, if you're really going to jump early and dive right into that pit, you'll find a secret instead. And with that, we will wrap up this week. There's a lot going on here, and that's just the first 30 seconds. Try breaking down the rest of level 1 as an exercise for yourself. Why are these 2 pyramid like that?
Okay. Let's see if I can get my sound back. Hello. Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
But I do have a kid mocking me now because I hit that secret block every single time.
It's because you know it's there.
Yeah, totally. 100%.
Yes.
The first time, however, she didn't know it was there, so.
So the game design worked, and she found the secret.
That is true.
That's pretty cool, huh?
But also, like, she's a horror game.
Just takes practice. So, like that video showed, Mario and other games like that, some of the first games, they didn't have, tutorials or, this is how you're going to play the game. So they had to build all that in a way that when the player was playing the game, they were able to see, the way the game works. They were able to experiment and experience the game, and learn from it, which is a really powerful thing to design into a game. So that the video went over the basic mechanics of Mario. All games have their own mechanics. They don't all have to be like Mario's. But player interaction, like the way the player interacts with the game specifically, is something that you want to think about when you're trying to design a game. And so once you have kind of the idea from the game design document and how you want the player to be able to play the game, a lot of people, the next step they'll take is prototyping. So what you see on this screen is a GIF of a prototype someone made. They just put squares, rectangles, and boxes for everything. But they were able to add the functionality to it. So now this white box is their character, and it can jump. And not only can it jump, it hits walls, and it falls when gravity affects it. It can also jump off the walls. It can do a little wall jump, like some platformer games do. So that's something that a lot of game designers will do before they have any of the art done, just so that they know, this is how I want the game to feel when I play it. But I don't necessarily have the art skills to make the things I want. So in this case, they would probably be hiring artists to make make the assets that replace these prototype squares. So, where's all the art? The first thing we'll go over is concept. And I'll specifically be using Cuphead as my example here. So, what we see here is Cuphead concept art. And this is all from the Art of Cuphead book, which is a pretty cool book. So, this on the top left here is basically the first drawing they did of Cuphead. It doesn't quite look the same as the final character, and that's okay. These things can evolve as you work on them, and they always will. So, concept art, the concept of a game can have multiple different facets to it. So, a lot of times you'll have character concepts, you'll have, designs for the levels, how you want certain things to look. Basically, anything you want to see in the game is something that you can make concept art of. So we see more drawings of Cuphead, kind of exploring the idea of, how does his head work? How does a cup for a head actually function on a person with a body? Can he, shrink down and put a lid on the cup? Can he... Does his straw always stay in his head? Like, there's lots of things that they were thinking about when they work on this character. But then there's also, they did a basic map of World 1. And you can see in this concept, they did kind of like the way Mario looks. That's not how Cuphead ended up looking, but this is part of their concept, right? So they thought, this is one way it could work. Let's draw it, make that the plan for now, and then we can improve on it later. So then below that is some of the art that ended up being turned into the overworld map in the game. And there's some exploration of kind of Cuphead's capabilities over here, and then what they thought a 2D level could look like if they were doing a whole side-scrolling game. So yeah, lots of concepts are a good thing. If you have an idea, try drawing it, and you can make something cool. So then, the next part to consider, once you have concepts for things, you want to think about the world that your game is in. In Cuphead, excuse me, they used old-timey cartoons and the same production methods that those cartoons used as an inspiration for their game. So they made all these fully painted backgrounds that were like watercolor on paper. And all of these are just, they're just paintings. They're just works of art that somebody made, but they were able to plan it in a way that they use these different paintings as the assets in the game. So they have, the far background is almost always just a painting in the game. But in front of that, there's other elements, like, there's these buildings, or there's a boat in the water. And this is another more refined version of the progression of a level at the bottom. So this is something that they planned out. They drew, the player's gonna start on the left here, and they're gonna go to the right. And then, this is how it gets more complicated as it progresses. So as far as art goes, I kind of broke down the visual art into the categories of art that are made for games. So there's, the concept is one category of art. The world art or environment art is another category. There's artists who specifically work on environmental art for all kinds of games. They don't have to be 2D games, but this is the 2D art for that. So then there's also character art, and character art is where you get more specific about.
Hey Liz,
Yeah.
did you see the Craigbot thing in the chat?
Yeah, I did. The thank you, Lily. The reason why there's that second one is because they've had failure with a single one, so that second one is redundant.
Okay, cool. Just making sure.
Yep.
Cool. So, what time is it? Okay, I should hurry up maybe. Character art is where they explore, everything they want to see the character do on the screen. So these are some ideas about, this is pretty much what Cuphead will do when you enter a level. Like, he'll do some kind of little animation to show that he's ready, basically. But they also plan out things like what happens when you get a power-up, what happens when you die, you turn into this little ghost and you float up. They also plan out, this on the right is a specific animation similar to this one of Cuphead. This is Mugman's intro into the levels. So character art can be planning what characters do, how, their range of emotions, how they're going to express themselves visually. They can also be, for the bad guys, the enemy characters. It could be for the bosses. And another important thing that character artists do is make a turntable or a turnaround of the character. So on the bottom right here, this is actually a really important piece of art. This is Mugman's style sheet. This is his turnaround. So this is what he would look like from a front view, 3/4 view, side view, 3/4 facing away, and if he was looking away. So with that, they're able to see what Mugman would look like if he, was walking in a circle. You can see every angle of him. And then over here on the left side of it, you can see it has 2 cups, 2.5, 2.25 actually, 2.25 cups, and that's Mugman's proportions, which is something that we'll talk about later in the character design. Another art category that people work in is effects art. So in this game, I tried to get some GIFs that show it, but basically everything you do, every projectile Cuphead has, every time it makes an impact, if there's rain, if there's, electricity or any kind of other things, that all has to be drawn out and thought of. So effects art is another important category of art that people work in that sometimes gets overlooked, but it's a very important thing to have in the game is effects, because it wouldn't feel quite the same if you were fighting this 3-headed dragon and you fired off your special attack and it just had a little blue dot moving across the screen. That doesn't have quite the same impact as this effect where, there's this big cloud of dust, this giant fireball going forward, and like a little zigzaggy explosion type thing right where you let off the attack. Like, there's a lot of layers to the artwork that are important to consider. And then another category, and these are all just visual art. There's all kinds of art that goes into video games. But another category is interface art. Cuphead doesn't have a lot of interface because most of what you do is the characters' interactions with things. So like in the store, you can hover over the power-up items and click on them, but other than that, there's not a lot of interface that has to happen there. There are a lot of interface screens that show information, which is another important thing, but that gets into graphic design also. So maybe it's not quite the art that you want to make, but graphic designers do want to make that. So yeah, and then this is the main interface card in Cuphead where you choose your weapon and your power up, and you can look at your progress. And it's all in this one menu with these 5 buttons. Another example of a different kind of interface is Among Us. I chose Among Us because a lot of you are probably familiar with that, and its interface is very simple, right? So this is very default, kind of. If you're making a game in a game engine, it'll have some basic interface options. And what the game designers with Among Us did is they focused more on the gameplay than they did the interface. Like, it's not super important to them how the shop menu looks, like how fancy it is. They didn't spend a lot of extra time designing interface. They focused on the gameplay. So then on the tasks, right? The tasks are another thing that you interface with in the game, but all of those interface items are part of the task. So it's a different kind of interface, but it's still considered user interface art, because you're still clicking buttons and touching things on the screen to make things happen. So now we get into some of the art basics. So pixel art. Actually, first, there's a few different ways that art can be made digitally, and there's actually a lot of ways, but these are the main few ways. So there's pixel art. What that is, if you look at Pikachu over here, it's basically anytime you're looking at a screen, the information you're seeing is pixels. So pixel art has a 1-to-1 correlation there. So basically, you choose what color you want each pixel to be on the screen. So it's structured in a grid. You do 1 pixel at a time to make little Pikachu or whatever. And you're very intentionally placing the colors. So these are all some different examples of pixel art. This one's not from a game, but it's showing that you can still make like paintings, but they're not using painting methodology, right? So they're using pixels specifically to make the art. And then Mario up here on the top left, these are all the sprites that the first Mario game uses. So it might be more or less than you thought, but it's interesting to see, there's a lot, 7, 14, there's probably like 64 different little drawings here of Mario.
Do you know off the top of your head whether the flipped images are separate pieces of art, or if they had the mechanics to flip them within the console?
I think they had the mechanics to flip them, so they didn't quite have to have all of this.
Okay.
But I'm not actually sure about that. They might have had to have both.
Okay, I was curious. I was curious because the old consoles, we think, oh, it's easy just to flip it if there's no like shine or something like that. But the old consoles were super limited. I don't know which way is more limiting. So I was just curious.
I bet. Now that I'm thinking about it, I bet you're right that they didn't have that. They weren't able to just flip things. I think it was just, this is where your pixels display. If you want them to display something different, it has to be a different image. I'm pretty sure that's how it worked. So maybe they did need all these directions for that. So yeah, pixel art is an art style that a lot of games use because it's what most of the first games started with, using pixel art. So another thing to consider is vector art. And what that is, it's basically a workaround to pixels. So although all the information you see on a screen is displayed in pixels, that's not how the computer or the game console has to think of it. So vector art is basically mathematical information that tells the computer or whatever you're using where it wants to show pixels without having to actually put each pixel. So you might think like, that's interesting, but what's the benefit of that? Vector art is infinitely scalable because it's just these mathematical points that give the information rather than pixels, which, the more pixels you display, the more information you have to process. So by having vector art, you can make art that you can then output. If you want, you can output that to pixel art at any size you want. So you'll see this curve next to it. That's an example of vector art. This is called the Bezier curve. And what that is each of these squares is the only place that they've put information. Actually, the Beziers are kind of strange on this curve. I don't think they actually match the curve. But the idea is that every place you put a point, so this curve only has 4, 5, 6 points, maybe 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 points of information. Whereas if you were drawing each pixel of this curve, there would be thousands of them, right? So it's just a different way to work. And Among Us is another game that uses vector art. It doesn't quite use it the same way I'm describing. It does what I said previously, where they make all the assets using vector art, and then they're able to output those as their own images.
Does that make it nicely portable for, because Among Us gets played on tiny screens and giant ones?
Right, yeah. So that's another thing, but basically what that enables the designers or the artists to do is, if they want, like, say if Among Us was suddenly going to run on a much higher resolution, it makes them able to output those larger graphics without having to remake the art. So that's part of the reason that they, it was originally just on iPads, I think, or just on tablets, and it recently came to consoles. And part of that process was outputting the bigger art to make sure everything can display the way it's supposed to. But yeah, a lot of, I think Ibn Ab might actually use vectors, but it might not. I don't know of any games off the top of my head that actually use the mathematical vector information. But vector art is a very important tool for artists who want to make scalable art.
When I went looking into whether or not vector art could be ported directly to the games, it looks like the game engines can't handle processing it at that speed. So I'm not sure about Unreal Engine, but I know that both Unity and Godot they'll take vector art and then turn it into pixel art themselves, but they can't handle. Apparently, it takes. I wouldn't think it would, but it apparently takes a bunch more processing power to produce vector art on the fly.
I guess that's the trade-off is vector art is much simpler for the computer to create if it's a still image, but if it's something that needs to be dynamically changing and calculating, like in a game, that is much easier for a computer to use static images for. So they, it's not saying that everything should just be made as, just a painting or a pixel art, because that's what's easier for the game engine to use. But I forgot where I was going with this. But basically, yeah, the vector art is almost always translated into a still image that is raster graphics, which is basically pixel art, because raster graphics are very simple for computers to interpret and handle. And so, like, your question about the porting Among Us to different platforms, there's also another tool that game engines use called mip mapping, or level of detail, where if you have this is the biggest size it's ever going to need to be, the game engine can dynamically make smaller versions of that without having to have the artist, output 20 different sizes of something. That's something that most game engines will handle for you. And then there's digital painting, which is basically pixel art, but it uses more complicated tools. So the end product is still a pixel, it's raster graphics, meaning that it is stuck at the pixels that you painted it at. But they can be painted at really high resolutions, and there are some animation tools that. So this old lady here with the battle axe, she's a character that's rigged in a program called Spine, and that program allows you to take like a digital painting that's really complicated, and it's a pretty high resolution piece of art, and it allows you to add kind of a basic skeleton to it, so that you can animate that art without having to draw every single separate frame of the animation, like we saw with Mario in the pixel art. Like this soldier down here, I guess he's a soldier, Centurion, he is probably just like 4 pieces of art. Probably one for the cape, one for that front arm, one for the body and legs. Maybe the legs are separate. And then that back arm. Those are probably all separate layers. And they have, there's ways to combine, whatever you make into one cohesive piece of art that's, that works together. So this is one way of animating digital paintings rather than thinking of it as pixel art. Because most pixel art is animated through, the same way that most animation used to work, is that you would draw every single frame of the animation if you wanted it to change. Whereas this is more similar to 3D animation, where you have that asset and you're able to manipulate that asset rather than having to redo it every time. So, real quick, we'll go over some character design basics, and then we'll get into questions. So one thing to consider with any flat visual image is the silhouette. So we'll start here in the bottom right corner. These are some silhouettes of famous video game characters, and you can see that they're all very distinct from each other. Like, you can probably tell, if you know who these characters are, you can probably tell who they are just from their silhouette. But this screenshot above that, is from a game called Thomas Was Alone, I think, and it's actually just squares and rectangles, and it has like some pixel art effects in it, but that's one thing that shows that, you know, the art doesn't have to be super complicated in order to be a good game. Like, this is actually an enjoyable game for a lot of people, and you play as a red cube, so it's pretty interesting. So one thing to consider when designing characters is the proportions. Excuse me. The average human is about 7.5 heads tall, and that's usually how proportions are measured, because everything is proportionate to your head, basically, if you're a humanoid character. So yeah, regular people are about 7.5. If you get 8 heads tall, then they start looking kind of like comic book characters, or you know, sometimes there will be. You can make characters of any head height you want, and each of those have different kinds of feelings to them. So like really epic characters like Superman, he's probably like 10 heads tall because his body is so long compared to his head. Or like Samus, even right here. Samus is probably about 10 heads tall, whereas Mario is maybe 2.5, maybe 3. And Mugman, like we saw earlier, is only 2.25, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, there's lots of variety that can be had, because lots of variety that can be had with creating characters just based on their proportions. And that's why I included this image here. This person was just kind of exploring different shapes as character elements and different head heights. So this character on the bottom left has like a lot of heads in his height. Like, he has a really small head compared to his body. But that might not work for the game, the kind of game you're trying to make. So I don't know, that's just something that's really cool to consider, and can have a big impact on how your character is perceived by the player or the audience. If you want, we can I can have some of you try to guess who these are. Okay, bottom right in G4, who's this?
Pac-Man.
Good job. What about number B2 here?
Pikachu.
Yep, good. I don't know if you guys know this one. How about D1? This is actually 2 characters.
I'm gonna say Sully, and that's not Sully, but
Guitar.
Yeah, it's Banjo and Kazooie. Which is, yeah, these are all pretty cool characters, but I'll move on. Another thing you want to consider in character design is the color palette. And we'll talk briefly about different color palettes. So on the bottom right here, basically, there's 6 basic color groups that most color palettes are in. There's monochromatic, which is just one color for the most part, varying shades. You can have complementary colors, which are opposite colors on the color wheel, like red and blue, or orange and blue, or yellow and purple, that kind of thing. You can split that, where instead of having the opposite purple to this yellow, you can have this kind of indigo blue and this violet as a split complementary. And then analogous colors, which is something that a lot of things use, is where you pick a color. So in this case, it's the purple. And then you use the colors immediately adjacent to it. The color families adjacent to it, rather. So this is like pink, purple, and indigo here. Triadic is called triadic because it's like a triangle. Basically, you draw a triangle on top of the color wheel, and then wherever those triangle tips end up, that's the colors you're gonna work with. So, blue, yellow, and pink would be one. Green, orange, and purple would be one. You'll notice that, I guess this is supposed to be blue actually, is the red, yellow, and blue are the three primary colors. The primary and secondary colors are triadic by default, which is interesting. Then you can have tetradic, which is basically two sets of complementary colors. And there's just some color things here about what kind of colors were most popular in certain years of video games. I don't know the point of that, but it was kind of interesting to see. So then, if you look at the examples over here, the character sheets, they list the colors. So for the big bad cat, they list the colors, and all of them use black and white. So this cat has 6 other colors that it uses for everything else. And that's part of the design process, is they decide what colors they want to use for the character. And usually what informs that is the world, so the other art that they've already done. And you can decide all this up front, or it can be something that evolves. Like if you wanted to have a very specific color palette in your game, like I should have put this in here, but Limbo is a black and white game that has, like, I think it has some elements of color that are only used for certain things. But most of the time, games will try to stick to one color palette. If there's an image that can be taken of the game, it needs to be in a cohesive kind of feeling color. Because the color, it can change throughout the game. But like this picture of Ori and the Blind Forest, what color palette do you think that would be? Which of these 6 kinds of color palettes do you think that would be?
The analogous, or however you say that one.
Yes. So this is almost certainly an analogous color scheme, where it has like the purples, the blues, the pinks happening there. And when they designed the character, they knew that it would be going through a lot of these colorful areas. And that's why a lot of the times you'll see main characters that are very white or black, or like they're a color that won't be confused with the background. Unless that's the point of the game, unless it's like a stealth game. But yeah, you'll see that a lot of games use a complementary color for the main character, because they always want you to be able to tell where the character is on the screen. And then this is Ibn Ab up here. And it, I think, is probably using a split complementary palette, because it has that kind of blue and green, and then the pink of the main character. You can see, like, this uses a lot of variation in those colors, but it still sticks to one of these kind of color themes. So, what did we miss? There's a lot of other art that goes into video games. One thing we didn't talk about is storyboards. For planning, it can be part of the game design document also, where you plan the way you want certain things to flow, or it can be, you can plan for cutscenes. So this one specifically is from a cutscene in Cuphead, where they did this basic sketch of how they wanted it to progress. They did this more kind of detailed storyboard. Then this is what it actually looks like in the game, where there's pages of a book that it's turning to tell you the story of Cuphead. We kind kind of talked about concept art. 2D texture art is something that will be in every single video game you play, unless the game is just using solid colors. So even 3D games will use 2D art, and texture art is somewhere that people can use their 2D art skills to contribute to a game that maybe is not a 2D game at all. So this is a Minecraft texture, obviously, and then this is kind of just a hand-painted, maybe roof shingles kind of texture. This is actually Mario 64. This is the main character's texture. It has the polygons overlaid on top of it, so it's kind of hard to see the actual texture. But this is how that texture map is displayed on the 3D model. So every 3D model that has a texture on it, it has had that texture painted by an artist, which is pretty cool. And then, of course, art can also be used in advertising or posters or promotional art. This game box cover for Pac-Man is pretty crazy looking, but it's still some cool art that somebody was able to make. So yeah, and then there's my advice, I guess, for getting started is just draw. Like, if you have an idea for something cool, some visual thing that you want to get down, try to draw it. You can draw it bad. You can draw it bad a lot of times. Like, as long as you draw something, you'll get better, and whatever you draw can be improved later. So don't get too caught up thinking, I can't draw, but I want it to be perfect the first time, but that's never going to happen. So draw, play games, and do research. A lot of games are based on other games. You'll find that most games have, like, the idea for almost every game has already been done by someone else, but what makes it a new game is, doing it a different way, having it be influenced by that, but, like, putting your own spin on it. So playing games is, I think, just as important as researching or doing actual work to make games. And then document your ideas. Draw, write. If you want to make a game design document, that'd be cool. Like, if you have a cool idea, just write it down. Keep a log of it somewhere. It doesn't have to be anything professional or complicated. It can be just writing down in a notebook.
This is Aaron's husband, for the record.
As long as you get your ideas out of your brain, then it's something that can be, made, can be fleshed out into a real thing eventually. And then the last thing is get feedback. Whenever you're doing something creative, it's great to hear what other people think about it. Every time I make a piece of artwork, I will ask usually my coworkers or a close group of friends or something to look at it, to tell me how I could make it better, or, like, if something isn't working the way I want it to, I want to know how other people perceive it. So whenever you're making something creative, getting feedback can be extremely helpful. And with that, I think that's pretty much it. If there's any questions, I answer them.
We'll give a nice long pause here for people to think through whatever questions they might have.
And I realized kind of late to the game that maybe my presentation wasn't quite what it should have been, but I hope it was still helpful.
No, it was great.
Cool. We'll go back through some images if anyone wants to could guess who these characters are. Does anyone know F2? And if anyone does have questions, there's just feel free to ask.
I'll recognize him when you tell me who he is, but...
Oh, so that's Sackboy from Little Big Planet.
Ah, yes, okay.
And then, how about this one above him? I don't know if anyone is old enough to have played that, though. I mean, hopefully you guys are playing games that are much older than you are. But, does anyone see one they definitely recognize that we haven't talked about?
E3.
E3. Who's that?
I think that's Kirby.
No, D3.
Oh, D3, yes. That is Kirby. I think E3 is the Big Daddy from BioShock.
Well, that's close enough to Kirby.
Yeah.
D4
Pretty
looks
close.
like Steve,
Yep, I bet that is
yeah.
Steve.
and A3 looks like Sonic.
Yep.
A3 is Sonic, yep.
I bet
Definitely.
B3 is Spyro, but that's not a game I got into.
That
Yeah.
is Spyro.
Have we done A1?
A1? No, we haven't.
Pretty sure that's Mario.
It is Mario.
C4 is Donkey Kong.
Yep, that's right.
G2 is Yoshi.
Yep, that's right.
G1 is Samus, I think.
Correct. Yeah, I think so too.
I wouldn't have gotten that one if you didn't have Samus on. So,
Yeah. The silhouette can be kind of pretty different depending on the pose they're in, right?
mhm.
So that's another thing to consider when you're designing a character is how that character is going to move on screen. And you want to make sure that even when it's moving, like in its different poses, you want it to have that recognizability still.
You want to make sure it doesn't look like anything really dumb if it's a...
Yeah.
Correct.
Right.
What is B4? It has a lot of floating parts.
B4 is Rayman.
Oh.
Which I don't think it has had a recent game, but it was a game that was pretty popular in the 90s, I think.
Like the rabid.
Yeah.
That's been on
part of
Switch.
Okay.
So.
Cool.
Is A2 the guy from Halo? Name I don't know.
Yeah, that's Master Chief.
And E2 is from Portal.
Yep, that's one of the turrets from Portal.
Go.
Nice.
It looks like some Star Wars got like squeezed and put on a stand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know who all of these are.
Well,
And what?
we are running out of time, but I thank you, Jake, for talking with us. And I assume if anyone comes up with any questions last minute, we can pass them on to you and relay the answers back.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. And I will be putting all of this stuff up on our documentation, and I will also try and include the links that he used in his presentation, the various like the game design documentation links and stuff in the documentation, so that you can have easy access to it. But
and I've got I don't know if some of the links work, but I have that game design document. I have the PDF version of that, so that's something I can share also.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you a bunch, and we look forward to maybe hearing from you sometime again in the future if we boot this back up in the fall. So
great, sounds good.
awesome.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.